A glittering mansion dinner, a proud, pregnant wife smiling beside her parents. Then the unthinkable happens. Her millionaire husband explodes in rage and kicks her to the ground in front of everyone, even her own mother and father. That one brutal act sets off a storm that will shake the entire city, because her father is not just any man. He is a powerful CEO, and he is about to turn all of his influence into a weapon of justice. What follows is betrayal, exposure, and the collapse of an empire built on lies. And trust me, you will not believe how this ends until we dive in. Tell us what time it is, where you are, and where you're listening from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The mansion glowed under 1,000 lights, chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls of crystal, champagne glasses sparkling as servants moved silently between the guests. To the outside world, this was the image of wealth, refinement, and perfect domestic happiness. Tonight was meant to be a celebration, a moment of pride. The millionaire husband stood at the center of it all, polished shoes reflecting the marble floor, his hand on the shoulder of his pregnant wife. Her parents sat nearby, proud, smiling, believing their daughter had married into a life of comfort and security. But behind the gold and glitter, behind the laughter of guests, tension simmered. The millionaire's smile was sharp, brittle, as though his teeth were clenched behind it. His wife's hands rested protectively on her swollen belly. She felt the weight of 2 lives inside that hall, her own and the child's, and she sensed something dark in the air, a shadow creeping through the bright room. The father of the bride raised a toast. His words were filled with gratitude, hope, and the conviction that his daughter had chosen wisely. Glasses lifted, applause followed, cameras flashed. Yet the husband's eyes burned, not with pride, but with fury. To him, the evening was not a celebration. It was a stage where control seemed to slip from his grasp. He hated the way her parents looked at him, with judgment disguised as courtesy. He hated the quiet strength he saw in his wife's eyes. Then it happened. A single spark ignited the explosion. Maybe it was a whispered word, maybe a look that pierced too deep. His voice rose above the music, harsh, angry, cutting through the polite chatter. Guests turned, their smiles fading. The wife, pregnant and fragile, tried to calm him, to lower her voice, to shield the scene from her parents' eyes. But the millionaire refused to be calm, and then, in one brutal instant, he lashed out. His foot drove forward, a savage kick landing against the stomach that carried his own child. A scream shattered the air, high and piercing, echoing through the vaulted hall. The wife crumpled, arms instinctively curling around her belly, her face twisted with pain and terror. The father and mother leapt to their feet, their eyes wide, their voices choked, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The room froze, music stopped. Every glass seemed suspended in the air. Guests stared in disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. For a moment, silence was heavier than any sound. A woman clutched her pearls. A man dropped his phone, the screen lighting up the marble floor. The millionaire himself stood rigid, chest heaving, his face red, his jaw tight. He had done it, and there was no taking it back. Her mother's hands trembled as she tried to reach her daughter. The father's voice broke as he called out for help. His authority useless in that instant, his heart shattering as he saw the child he once carried, now carried a child of her own, struck down by the man who vowed to protect her. Whispers began to rise, sharp and horrified. "Did you see that? He kicked her. In front of her parents." Phones lifted. Cameras clicked. Evidence was already spreading, unstoppable. The image of a wealthy man, admired by society, had cracked open in one violent act. The pregnant woman lay on the marble floor, tears mixing with the shine of crystal light. She gasped for breath, her hands clinging to her stomach, whispering words of comfort to the life within. She did not think of herself. She thought of the child. She thought of survival. The parents knelt beside her, shielding her from the eyes of the crowd. Their faces were pale, their bodies shaking. They knew the truth now. This was not just a marriage stained by cruelty. This was a crime committed in the open, before their very eyes. And as the millionaire stood above them, sweat forming on his forehead, the weight of the silence pressed in. In that moment, his empire of wealth and pride began to crumble, not from the loss of money, but from the exposure of his soul. The audience had seen, the parents had seen, The entire city would soon know. The hospital lights were cold, fluorescent, and unforgiving. They hummed softly, a mechanical chorus that filled the silence of the sterile room. The woman lay on the narrow bed, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Every movement was careful, protective. Her hands never left her stomach, as if her embrace alone could shield the child inside from the violence of that night. Doctors came and went, their voices low, their expressions guarded. They spoke in clinical terms, measured and precise, but the weight of their words pressed heavy on her heart. Rest, observation, risk. She nodded to every instruction, but inside, her mind spiraled. The pain in her body was real, yet it was the pain in her soul that left her trembling. Her parents sat nearby, broken by what they had witnessed. The mother's eyes were red, her hands folded in constant prayer. The father sat stiff, fists clenched, his jaw locked in silence. They wanted answers, they wanted justice, but for now, their daughter's fragile state demanded calm. They swallowed their anger, because anger could wait. Her survival could not. The woman, though battered, refused to cry in front of them. She turned her face to the wall, hiding the tears that slid quietly down her cheek. She did not want them to see her weakness. She wanted to protect them, even as they tried to protect her. The cruel irony was not lost on her. She was the victim, yet she was still the one trying to shield others from pain. In the quiet hours of the night, when her parents dozed in the chairs beside her bed, she whispered softly to the child within her, words of comfort, promises of safety. She told the baby that the world was cruel, but that she would fight to bring light into it. Her voice trembled, but her resolve grew with every syllable. The memory of the kick replayed in her mind like a haunting film reel. The look on his face, the sharpness of his voice, the gasps of the crowd, the frozen horror in her parents' eyes. Each image carved itself deeper, refusing to fade. She asked herself why. Why had she stayed silent so long? Why had she covered his anger with excuses? Why had she believed wealth could soften brutality? She thought of the bruises hidden under sleeves, the excuses she had made for sudden absences, the lies she told herself to keep the picture of a perfect marriage intact. And now, that picture was shattered, shards scattered across the marble floor of a mansion that no longer felt like home. The doctors checked her again, shining lights into her eyes, listening to the beat of the unborn child. Relief came with the sound, steady and strong. The baby was holding on. That small heartbeat became her anchor, pulling her back from despair. As long as the child lived, she had a reason to endure. Her parents wanted to call the police immediately, but she shook her head. She begged them to wait. Not yet. She told them she needed time. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps shame, perhaps the stubborn hope that she could protect the child from a scandal that would devour them all. She believed silence could buy safety, even as the truth burned in her chest. The father's eyes filled with rage, but he listened. The mother wept quietly, stroking her daughter's hand. They stayed beside her through the night, powerless but present, their love the only shield they could offer. The woman closed her eyes and tried to rest, but sleep would not come. She knew the pain would not fade in the morning. The bruises would remain, and so would the truth. She had lived through violence in the open. Now she would live with violence in the shadows. And the world beyond the hospital walls was already whispering, already watching, waiting for the story to break. The days in the hospital blurred into each other, a cycle of whispered prayers, cautious checkups, and silent tears. She held on for the child, but deep down she knew the truth could no longer be hidden. Rumors had already begun to spread. The wealthy never suffered in silence for long. Eyes were watching, voices were whispering, and the cracks in the millionaire's perfect facade were widening. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, her father entered with a face carved from stone. He placed a folder on the table by her bed. She looked at him with dread, sensing what lay inside. He said little. He did not need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Photographs, dozens of them. Her husband, smiling easily in places he had claimed to be working. His arm wrapped around another woman, younger, dressed in shimmering gowns at exclusive parties. Their faces close, their bodies careless in their intimacy. These were not rumors. These were facts captured in unforgiving light. She turned the photos slowly, her hands trembling. every image stabbed deeper than the bruises on her body. She remembered nights alone, excuses about late meetings, the scent of perfume that was not hers. She had pushed those suspicions aside, desperate to preserve the illusion of a family. Now there was no illusion, only betrayal laid bare. Her mother sat beside her, trying to steady her, but the wife could not be calmed. Tears streamed down her face, silent at first, then breaking into sobs that shook her fragile body. She pressed her hands against her belly, whispering to the child, trying to shield it even from her own despair. The folder held more than photographs. It contained receipts, messages, screenshots, transfers of money to hidden accounts, reservations for luxury hotels. Each page was another confession, not written in words, but in actions. Each page told her that love had never been part of the equation. She had been a pawn, a possession, a name to strengthen his social standing. The mistress was not a secret to his circle. In fact, whispers revealed that many already knew. They had laughed about it behind closed doors, while she smiled politely at gatherings, oblivious to the truth. The betrayal was not only personal, it was public. She had been the last to see it, the last to accept that her marriage was nothing more than a carefully crafted deception. Her father's voice finally broke the silence. He told her she deserved more than lies. He told her the time for silence was over, but she shook her head, unable to form words. The betrayal was too raw, the humiliation too deep. She felt stripped of everything, even her dignity. In the stillness of that hospital room, she realized she had lost not only her husband's love, but also the dream she had clung to so tightly. The dream of a home built on trust. The dream of a child raised in safety. It all collapsed with every photograph she turned, with every receipt she read. The despair that filled her chest was suffocating. She felt as though the walls were closing in, as though the air itself had become heavy. Her parents tried to console her, but their words could not reach the place inside her that had been broken. She closed the folder at last, her hands shaking, her face wet with tears. The truth was undeniable. The man who had promised to cherish her, the father of her child, had betrayed her in every possible way. He had not only struck her body, he had struck her heart, her trust, her very soul. And in that realization, despair deepened. She was no longer only a victim of violence. She was a woman abandoned, deceived, and humiliated. Her life had been built on lies, and now those lies had crumbled, leaving only ruins. The darkness pressed closer, and she wondered if light would ever return. The silence in the hospital room could no longer hold the storm. For days he had watched his daughter suffer in quiet agony, her body bruised, her spirit shaken, her hope broken by betrayal. He had seen her cry when she thought no one was watching. He had seen her clutch the evidence of infidelity as if it were poison seeping into her hands. And something inside him shifted. He was not only a father. He was a man of power, a leader of industry, a CEO whose decisions had shaped empires. Now he would shape the fate of the man who had dared to harm his child. He rose from his chair with the steady presence of a man who had carried responsibility his entire life. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, yet filled with fire. He told his daughter that she would no longer face this battle alone. He told her that the days of silence were over. His words were not a plea, they were a vow. Her mother looked at him with a mixture of fear and relief. She knew what such a vow meant. When this man made a promise, he did not retreat, he did not surrender, and he did not fail. His daughter tried to protest, whispering that she did not want more scandal, that she feared the public eye, but he placed a steady hand on hers. His eyes locked with hers, full of compassion yet burning with determination. He told her she was not only his child, but also the mother of his grandchild. And for both of them, he would stand against the storm. The weight of his authority filled the room. Nurses passing in the hallway glanced through the door, sensing something unspoken, sensing that this was not just a family conversation but the beginning of a reckoning. The father did not raise his voice, yet every word landed like a gavel striking in a courtroom. He declared that justice would not be delayed. He declared that no amount of wealth or status would shield a man who had chosen cruelty over love. He began to act swiftly, as if his business instincts had merged with his paternal rage. Calls were made, contacts were summoned. Lawyers, investigators, and allies who owed him favors were pulled into his orbit. He did not wait for the world to discover the truth. He would bring the truth into the light himself. For the first time since the violence, his daughter's eyes lifted with something other than despair. She saw the father she had always known, but now magnified by love and fury. She felt the weight of protection pressing against the darkness that had surrounded her. She realized she was no longer alone. The mother wept quietly, not from grief but from relief. Hope, fragile but real, entered the room. It was a hope built not on wealth or status, but on the unbreakable bond of family. The father's words carried beyond the walls of that hospital. Those who heard his voice over the phone, those who felt the urgency in his commands, knew that something monumental was about to unfold. The community would soon learn that this was not just a private scandal. This was a battle between cruelty and justice, between arrogance and truth. And in that moment, the story shifted. No longer was it only about a woman's suffering. It became about a father's stand. It became about a man who had built an empire, now turning all his power toward a single mission: to defend his daughter, to protect his grandchild, and to bring down the man who had shattered their trust. The audience that followed this story began to feel a spark. Amid the darkness, there was now a figure of strength, a figure who would not bend. Hope had entered the narrative, and with hope came the promise of justice. The father did not waste time. Once he made his vow, he moved like a man possessed. He had built his empire through discipline and relentless pursuit of truth. Now he turned those same skills against the man who had hurt his daughter. The investigation began quietly, but it spread quickly, reaching into corners the millionaire thought were hidden. Documents surfaced, pulled from corporate archives and secret accounts. Numbers that did not add up. Transfers routed through offshore banks. Loans disguised as investments. The trail was long, but the father's team followed it with precision. Every lie left a shadow. Every act of greed left a mark. Piece by piece, the double life of the millionaire began to emerge. He had not only betrayed his wife, he had betrayed investors, partners, and even his own name. Behind the luxury cars, the glittering parties, and the polished suits was a man drowning in debt, a man who clawed at power with both hands, willing to sacrifice anyone to maintain the illusion of success. Receipts revealed money spent on his mistress, more than most families would see in a lifetime. Secret properties purchased under false names, lavish trips paid for with stolen funds. Each discovery painted the picture of a man who was not simply flawed but deeply corrupt. The father reviewed the evidence late into the night. His hands shook, not from fatigue but from fury. Every page was a reminder that his daughter's suffering had been part of a larger web of deceit. The violence at the mansion was not an isolated act. It was the symptom of a man consumed by arrogance and greed. He shared the findings with his daughter, carefully, slowly, shielding her from the worst details. She listened, silent, her face pale but resolute. Each revelation tore at her heart, but it also steeled her resolve. The man she had loved no longer existed. Perhaps he never had. What she had married was a mask, and that mask was finally falling. The mother listened too, tears streaking her face. She whispered that she had always felt something was wrong, though she could never prove it. Now the truth was undeniable. The perfect son-in-law, the wealthy businessman admired by society, was nothing more than a criminal in disguise. As the evidence mounted, whispers turned into voices. Journalists caught wind of irregularities. Former employees spoke out. Partners demanded answers. The facade of wealth and power was cracking, and through those cracks spilled anger, not only from the family he had betrayed, but from the wider community that had trusted him. The father knew the time was approaching when secrecy would end. But before that day came, he wanted the foundation unshakable, every lie exposed, every document secured, every witness ready to stand in the light. The daughter sat by her hospital window, holding the folder of evidence close to her chest. She stared out at the city, lights flickering in the distance. Somewhere out there, her husband walked freely, still smiling, still pretending. But she knew the truth now, and she knew that truth was about to consume him. The audience following the story began to feel their blood boil. This was no longer just a marriage gone wrong. This was corruption. This was betrayal on every level. It was a story of greed wrapped in silk, of arrogance hiding behind money. And it was a story heading toward a reckoning that could no longer be stopped. The dark secrets had been dragged into the light. The mask was torn away, and the man who thought himself untouchable was now standing on the edge of ruin. The father had all the pieces, but raw evidence was not enough. He knew that to defeat a man who thrived on manipulation and appearances, the strike had to be calculated. This was no longer a matter of emotion. It was strategy, precision, and patience. The battlefield was not a boardroom, not yet a courtroom, but the hidden channels of power and influence. He began to weave his plan in silence. His lawyers drafted reports that would expose financial crimes. Investigators shadowed the millionaire's movements, documenting every meeting, every suspicious call, every exchange that might betray desperation. Trusted journalists received quiet tips, breadcrumbs that hinted at the collapse to come. The millionaire, once confident and arrogant, began to sense the shift. At first it was subtle. A partner canceled a dinner. An investor asked pointed questions. A banker avoided his calls. The cracks in his empire widened, and though he tried to patch them with smiles and promises, the unease around him grew heavier. He started to look over his shoulder. Every conversation felt watched. Every gathering seemed filled with whispers. He tightened his grip on his mistress, trying to find comfort in her presence, but even she began to ask questions he could not answer. He felt the world closing in, though he could not see the hands that guided it. The father's silence was deliberate. He wanted the millionaire to feel the pressure without understanding its source. He wanted the man to taste fear, to live each day wondering when the next blow would fall. The father did not need to shout his intentions. He let suspicion do the work. Suspicion could break a man faster than open confrontation. The daughter, still recovering in the hospital, watched her father's resolve with quiet awe. She saw the way he carried himself, calm yet unyielding, and she felt the first stirrings of strength in her own heart. She realized that justice was not only possible but inevitable. The war had begun, and though it was silent, it was moving with unstoppable force. Inside his mansion, the millionaire paced through empty halls. The laughter of past parties seemed to echo from the walls, mocking him. He tried to summon allies, but fewer and fewer answered his calls. Some gave excuses, others simply disappeared. Wealth that once drew people close now repelled them, poisoned by the scent of scandal. He pored over his accounts late at night, searching for stability, but every number seemed to betray him. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. His anger turned to paranoia, and paranoia turned to fear. The father, meanwhile, continued to set his traps. Meetings were arranged behind closed doors. Witnesses were prepared. Evidence was secured in vaults where no hand but his could reach. Each step was another thread in a net tightening around the man who thought himself untouchable. The atmosphere thickened with tension. Those who watched from the sidelines whispered of a coming storm. They did not yet know when or how it would break, but they sensed that the fall of the millionaire was no longer a question of if, but when. The daughter's heart beat stronger with every update. She no longer saw herself as powerless. She was part of the plan now, part of the force gathering against the man who had tried to destroy her. Her fear turned into quiet defiance. The silent war was underway. The traps were set, the pressure mounting. The millionaire could feel the walls closing in, yet he did not know which wall would fall first. That uncertainty gnawed at him more than any direct attack. It was the beginning of his unraveling. The hospital walls had heard her cries. They had witnessed her silence, her trembling, her tears hidden against the pillow. But those nights were over. The woman who once bowed her head in shame was gone. In her place stood a mother, a daughter, and a survivor. She had lived through violence and betrayal. Now she would no longer live in fear. It began with her voice, quiet at first, but firm. She told her father every detail she had once hidden. The bruises explained away as clumsiness, the unexplained absences covered by lies. The pain she carried alone. She spoke with clarity, every word an act of defiance. She was done protecting the man who had tried to destroy her. Her father listened in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. Each confession fueled his determination, but more than that, it gave him hope. His daughter was no longer just a victim. She was now a witness, a partner, a fighter. He had vowed to protect her, but now she was standing with him, ready to face the storm. Her mother held her hand, tears flowing not from sadness, but from pride. She had waited for this moment, the moment when her child would rise above despair. She whispered that strength had always been inside her, that motherhood would only make it stronger. The woman nodded, pressing her hand against her belly, feeling the steady rhythm of life inside. That heartbeat became her anchor, her reminder that she was fighting not only for herself, but for the child who deserved a future free of fear. The first act of her defiance was simple. She allowed her father's lawyers to record her testimony. Her voice was steady, her words clear. She described the violence in detail, the betrayal, the threats whispered in the dark. She did not flinch, even as memories clawed at her. Her testimony was no longer a secret confession. It was a weapon. News of her courage began to spread quietly. Within the hospital staff, whispers circulated. They had seen victims before, but rarely had they seen one rise so quickly, so fiercely. Nurses nodded with respect. Doctors looked at her with admiration. She was no longer invisible. She was becoming a symbol. The millionaire, hearing fragments of her defiance, began to tremble. He had believed her silence was his shield. He had believed fear would keep her loyal. Now that shield was shattered. Every word she spoke threatened to unravel him. He could feel the balance of power slipping, and for the first time, he knew she was no longer under his control. The woman began to walk again, slow steps through the hospital corridor, her gown trailing, her mother at her side. Each step was painful, but each step was proof. She would not remain broken. She was preparing herself for the battles ahead. At night, she whispered to her child again. But this time, the words were different. Not promises of survival, but promises of victory. She told the baby that they would see justice together, that they would walk into a brighter future. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was strong, steady, filled with fire. Her father watched with quiet pride. He had prepared his strategy, but now he saw that his daughter's courage would be the heart of the fight. Together, they were no longer a broken family hiding in the shadows. They were an unbreakable force, united by love and by truth. The audience watching this story could feel the shift. The woman who had once been silent was now the voice of defiance. Her tears had turned into weapons, her pain into power. The mother had risen, and with her rise came the promise that the man who had thought himself untouchable would soon face the consequences of his cruelty. The day of reckoning arrived beneath the midday Sunday. The city square stretched wide in front of the towering city hall, its steps crowded with people. Citizens gathered shoulder to shoulder, their voices buzzing with expectation. Reporters stood with cameras poised. Microphones caught the hum of the crowd. Every lens, every eye, was turned toward the stage that had been prepared. At the center stood the father, not simply a businessman, but now a symbol of defiance. His gray suit gleamed in the light, his posture commanding, his presence undeniable. He had summoned the city not for a celebration, but for a revelation. At his side was his daughter, fragile in appearance, yet steady in her resolve, the child in her womb giving her the strength of two lives. The air trembled with anticipation as the father raised his hand. Silence fell. Even the restless children clung to their parents, sensing that history was unfolding before them. His voice rang out, strong and measured, carried by speakers to every corner of the square. He spoke not of wealth or power, but of betrayal, cruelty, and lies. Then came the evidence. Papers were lifted, documents shown on large screens for all to see, records of fraudulent transactions, contracts signed in deception, transfers that revealed greed stripped bare. Gasps rippled through the crowd, each page another strike against the image the millionaire had crafted. But it did not end with numbers. Images of the mistress appeared, photographs of stolen moments that told their own story. Messages scrolled across the screens, words of infidelity that left no room for denial. Murmurs turned into shouts, outrage swelling like a tide. The man who once stood tall in society was now reduced to a figure of ridicule. And then, the father revealed the part that silenced even the loudest voices. A recording, clear and sharp. The millionaire's own voice, cold and cruel, dismissing his pregnant wife as nothing more than a burden. The crowd erupted in fury. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers shook their heads in disgust. Strangers shouted words of condemnation. The millionaire stood nearby, surrounded by aides who no longer dared to shield him. His face, once proud, had turned pale. Sweat dripped down his temple. He glanced at the cameras, at the countless phones raised high, and he knew that there was no escape. His empire of illusions had collapsed, not in the secrecy of a courtroom, but under the blinding light of day. The daughter did not speak. She stood beside her father, her head held high, her silence more powerful than any words. She looked at the crowd, at the faces of strangers who had become witnesses to her suffering and her defiance. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of shame lift. It was no longer hers to carry. It belonged to him. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones pushed forward. The father simply declared that justice would be delivered, that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, would stand above the truth. His words echoed across the square, carried into every home through live broadcasts, shared instantly across countless screens. The humiliation was complete. The millionaire who once demanded respect now faced the judgment of an entire city. Every whisper, every secret, every lie had been torn into the open. He lowered his head, trapped not by chains but by the relentless eyes of the people. The square erupted into applause for the father and his daughter. It was not only applause for their courage, but applause for justice itself. The city had seen the truth, and the city would never forget. The city square had witnessed the humiliation, but the story did not end there. Truth without consequence is only half a victory. The father knew it, the daughter knew it, and so did the thousands who had stood as witnesses. What came next was the machinery of justice, slow in appearance but unstoppable once set in motion. Within hours of the public revelation, officials moved. Investigators who had once hesitated now advanced with certainty. Police officers walked into the millionaire's offices, not as guests but as enforcers of the law. Their presence sent shockwaves through the building. Employees froze at their desks, eyes wide as they watched authorities stride down polished hallways. Orders were signed, accounts were frozen, properties sealed. What had taken years of manipulation to build was dismantled in a single day. Screens that once displayed rising profits now displayed red warnings of collapse. Partners withdrew, investors fled. The empire was not crumbling slowly. It was collapsing like glass struck by a hammer. The millionaire sat in his mansion, blinds drawn, hands trembling. He tried to make calls, but no one answered. His lawyers hesitated, his allies turned silent, and even his mistress disappeared from his side. For the first time in his life, wealth could not shield him, influence could not protect him. The walls of power he had built so carefully were gone, leaving him exposed. The knock on the door came in the early evening. It was not gentle. Police entered with firm steps, their uniforms a stark reminder that the law had finally caught up. Cameras outside captured every moment, the flashing lights painting the mansion in shades of blue and red. Neighbors watched from sidewalks, phones raised, recording the fall of the man who once lorded over them. Inside, he tried to protest, his voice cracking, his body trembling. He demanded respect, demanded delay, but his words carried no weight. The officers read him his rights with calm authority. His wrists were bound, the sound of the cuffs sharp in the silence of his once grand home. He was escorted out, no longer a figure of pride, but a criminal facing judgment. The crowd outside erupted. Applause, cheers, and shouts of satisfaction filled the night air. The city that had gasped in horror weeks before now breathed with relief. Justice was not only a headline, it was a scene they could see with their own eyes. The image of the millionaire, once untouchable, now led into a waiting car, would remain etched in memory. His company collapsed in the days that followed. Stock prices plummeted, offices closed, employees scattered. The empire that had stood as a monument to his ambition was reduced to ruins. Reporters wrote not of his success, but of his greed, not of his rise, but of his fall. The daughter, watching from her hospital room, held her child within her womb and allowed herself the first true breath of peace. She had endured violence and betrayal. Now she witnessed justice. Her mother wept beside her, and her father stood silently, knowing his promise had been fulfilled. For the public, the lesson was clear. Wealth could not erase cruelty. Status could not protect corruption. The law had spoken, and the people had spoken with it. The satisfaction was not cruel, it was righteous. It was the relief of knowing that arrogance and brutality had met their end. The millionaire was gone, his power stripped, his name stained forever. Justice had struck down, swift and undeniable. And the world moved forward, certain that some truths cannot be hidden, and some crimes cannot be escaped. The storm had passed. The noise of scandal, the flash of cameras, the roar of the crowd, all of it began to fade into memory. In the quiet of a small home surrounded by family, the woman finally felt safe. Her body still carried the marks of pain, but her spirit no longer trembled. The child within her had survived, and that survival was the seed of a new beginning. The hospital bed was replaced with the comfort of her parents' home. Curtains swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The scent of home-cooked meals filled the air. For the first time in many months, she could breathe without fear. She walked slowly across the room, hand on her belly, speaking softly to the child who would soon enter the world. Each word was filled with hope. Each promise was one she intended to keep. Her father stood nearby, not only as a parent but as the shield that had turned back the tide. His presence was steady, unshakable. He had fought with everything he had, not for power or pride, but for love. He had shown the world that family was stronger than greed, and that justice was not a dream, but a responsibility. The city looked at him with respect, but he cared only for the peace on his daughter's face. Her mother tended to her gently, her hands soft, her eyes bright with pride. Together, they created a circle of safety that no cruelty could penetrate. The house was no longer haunted by the echoes of betrayal. It was alive, with love, renewed, and enduring. The woman no longer saw herself as a victim. She was a survivor, a mother, and a voice that had broken silence. She had faced darkness and refused to surrender. Now she prepared to raise her child not with fear, but with strength. She whispered promises of a life built on truth, on loyalty, on compassion. Promises of a home where protection was real and love unbreakable. Outside, the city moved on, but it did not forget. The image of the millionaire's downfall remained etched in collective memory. People spoke of the courage of a woman who stood against cruelty, of a father who defended his family with unshakable resolve. The story became a lesson, told not only in headlines but in homes, a reminder that power without love crumbles, and arrogance without loyalty destroys itself. In time, the baby was born. The cries of new life filled the room, and with them came tears of joy. The mother held her child close, heart racing with gratitude. She had feared this moment would never come, but now it was real, tangible, undeniable. The father, the grandfather, stood close, eyes wet with emotion. The family had endured the storm, and now they welcomed the dawn. The story closed, not with revenge, but with renewal. The millionaire's empire was gone, his name stained, his arrogance silenced. But for the woman and her family, the end was not about his ruin. It was about their rebirth. It was about proving that love, real love, is not measured in wealth or in status, but in the courage to protect, the loyalty to stand firm, and the compassion to heal. And so, the tale reached its final chapter. A family torn apart by cruelty had been rebuilt by truth. A daughter once silenced had found her voice. A father once burdened had become a beacon. And a child, born of pain and perseverance, would grow in a home filled not with fear, but with love. The message lingered long after the story ended. True power is not found in fortune. True love is not found in hollow promises. True power, true love, is protection, loyalty, and the courage to stand for those who cannot stand alone.